welcome to the Artist Roundtable. It's a great pleasure to welcome Jesse Crimes this evening. Jesse, thank you for agreeing to do this talk. Very grateful for your time.
Of course.
And I am particularly excited to be talking with Jesse today because he has just come off the back of a year of very intense work. Well, a year and a half, really, if you count the launching of the Centre for Art and Advocacy, the nonprofit that he runs last July. He's just opened a show at the Met and also at the Jack Shaman Gallery, all in the last couple of weeks. So for those of you that are interested, go check out those shows. And tonight, Jesse and I have discussed that he will basically give a brief overview of his work, but then speak more about his recent practices and also the important aspect of the fact that Jesse works with a nonprofit that he's founded himself alongside his practice. And that aspect is very important to him as well. So, Jesse, over to you.
Thank you, Kate. And it's wonderful to be here. I can't see any of the participants, but I'm happy to join all of you, and I hope this is useful. So I'm going to try to share my screen here. Great.
And Jesse, as we have discussed at the moment, for those of you listening in, if you have any questions, put them into the Q&A and I will read them out as and when is appropriate as we're going along. And Jesse, I'll jump in as you were happy as you talk as well.
Absolutely. Yeah, so I think to start, just as a bit of grounding, I have pretty much explored a number of different materials throughout my practice. And so when I kind of go through the slideshow, you're going to see a lot of different bodies of work that, while they may kind of vary drastically with materials, conceptually, they kind of all revolve around issues of incarceration. And for me, that's such like a rich terrain to kind of mine as an artist, because if you think about the prison system and the incarceration, or the entire kind of carceral system and everything that goes into that, it's really kind of a microcosm of society. And so there's a lot of room to explore everything that happens in society and how that feeds into the carceral system. And so my works explore a lot of different materials, and I use like material language very specifically to convey some of these concepts in different ways. And my practice is really about trying to get viewers to see this issue from different perspectives, maybe challenge preconceived notions. But ultimately, it's a way of trying to, I think, both humanize people in the carceral system, but also kind of highlight all of the kind of added techniques of oppression and power that feed into the carceral system. So like both a micro and a macro view. And so I'm starting with this image. This is a body of work that I created when I was in solitary confinement. And so I was arrested. I got a 6-year federal prison sentence. And for the first part of that year, they had me in solitary confinement because I wouldn't basically cooperate and tell on other people. And so I was in this environment that is not necessarily conducive to creating artwork. So it's very limited materials, limited access. I'm basically locked in a cell 23 and a half hours a day for a year straight. And this is all pre-sentence. And so I very quickly realized when I was in that environment that I needed to find something to do with my time that would help me kind of hold on to this positive sense of identity that I knew kind of couldn't be taken away from me. And so when you start to think about the prison system, it is very much designed to dehumanize you, to get you to conform to this idea that you are somehow different or other than normal people in society. And so I made a very intentional decision early on that I was going to, A, use the time that I had in the prison system as productively as I possibly could, and B, that I was going to use the materials of the prison itself as a resource to create artworks that could then speak to some of these issues that I was encountering and kind of living through while I was inside. And so this is an image of purgatory. And I remember when I was creating this project, and coming into this, I had read Foucault's Discipline and Punish, which kind of traces the genealogical origins of the history of like corporal bodily punishment up into today, where we use what are supposed to be more humane forms of punishment. And I thought it was interesting because I was thinking about how they historically would kind of force people to come out into the town square, watch people be beheaded or hung as a form of state power and kind of, getting people in society to conform to ideals of whatever the laws or norms that they were trying to get people to conform to, and how that has transitioned to today, where we no longer have these events and force people to gather to see these very public kind of ceremonial executions. But what we do instead is we use the media. And when I was receiving my local newspaper, when I was inside, I kept coming across these mugshots of people who were arrested. And, there's like this narrative kind of describing this individual at one point in time, after making probably one of the most serious mistakes they've ever made in their life. And seeing that over and over and over again, it began to kind of click to me that this is just our contemporary form of beheading people, and also displaying that to the public to get people to conform to these ideas of what we want people to conform to. And so I started kind of removing the mugshots from newspapers, and I would transfer them onto the surface of prison issued soap. And again, the soap has all of these kind of connotations of a material that is designed for cleansing and purification. And if you think about that in relation to the prison system was originally designed, or at least the penitentiary, off of the word repentance. And so there's this whole kind of like cleansing and purification aspect that went into the idea of building an architectural structure to purify people through this experience. And so the soap became like a really interesting kind of medium for me to use and explore. And so I began transferring the mugshots, disconnecting them from their kind of stereotypical narratives, and removing them from those narratives and kind of leaving the inverse trace on the surface of the soap. And so in some ways, it begins to kind of complicate what these images are and what they represent. And then to kind of push that a little bit further, I started including images of politicians and celebrities, pretty much anyone who kind of appeared in these local newspapers, all as a way of kind of troubling the notion of like who we view as an offender, and really kind of encouraging viewers to think that through a little bit more in depth.
So, Jesse, you had already been to art school, right?
Yes, yeah. So I had just graduated from Millersville University, probably, oh, I don't know, maybe like a month or two before I got indicted by the federal government.
And the the soaps that you just showed us that you're now going to kind of explain further, it's like they would give you a soap every day, or how did it work? How did you get so many soaps? Because we just looked at a lot.
Yeah, so pretty much basically, I think once a week they would come by and hand us each 2 bars of soap.
Mm.
And I mean, the soap is like, it's terrible. If you actually use this for your skin, you'd be all dry and peely. It's like a very harsh chemical kind of compound for soap. And so typically most people didn't actually use this. But they would pass it out every week, no matter what. And most people who could afford, who weren't indigent, they would buy like Dove or Irish Spring or some other bar that you could buy off of commissary. And so the other guys who were in this kind of long corridor of solitary confinement would basically put the soap in a sock and pass their soaps down to me down the line so that I could use them as my materials.
Brilliant, thank you.
Yep. I guess I should say these are not full bars of soap either. So I would basically take one bar of soap, and again, this is solitary where I'm not really allowed to have tools to kind of work with, but they sold little Walkman radios on the commissary, and then you could buy AAA batteries to power your Walkman. And so to kind of like carve a single bar down, I basically took a AAA battery and I busted the cap open underneath my bunk, which was kind of loose from the cement. And I pulled out the interior connector, sharpened that on the cement floor, and then put deodorant labels around it, which made like a tiny little kind of carving cutting device. And so I would take one bar of soap and cut that down into probably, oh, I don't know, maybe like 12 little slivers of soap before I would transfer the images on. Because I wanted the size of the sliver to match the size of the mugshots in the newspaper. And then basically after creating them, I was making them for quite a while. And as soon as you start to begin to kind of alter prison property, it becomes contraband. And so these works very easily could have been confiscated and thrown away. I could have been written up. They couldn't have really done much else to me because I was already in the hole, or solitary confinement, as it's technically called. Um, but at the same time, they could have taken the works. And so I needed to figure out a way to kind of get them out of the system. And so I started, and this was really interesting to me. I started talking to, or not talking to, I started noticing how the same way that I was kind of creating artwork as a way to disengage from this environment, other guys on the block were playing cards through the bars of their cell. And it's really interesting to think about because if you think about the game of poker, a lot of it is based off of body language and reading people's tells and bluffing. But these people couldn't see each other because they would basically, one person in a cell would deal the cards, they'd put them in socks and they'd fish them down the hallway to the other people who are playing. And so no one could actually see who they were playing with or who they were playing against. And that became really interesting to me because it radically altered the kind of rules of the game, just through like visibility and vision and ways of seeing or not seeing. And so I started collecting their used playing cards, and I would basically cut out, basically trace over one soap and kind of get one card mapped out to the size of that specific soap. And then I would use that as a template and cut through 21 other cards. And I glued them all together using toothpaste. And so I began creating these kind of playing card containers to house the soaps because I knew that they would be, one, structurally like rigid enough that they would protect the soaps when I was mailing them through the postal system. But two, I think just conceptually, it added a really interesting element to this in that, these cards are depicting faces of royalty, kings, jacks, and queens. And so I began cutting the faces off of these kings, jacks, and queens and replacing them with that of the quote unquote kind of offender, all as a way of like leveling and complicating this like playing field. And then as I began doing this too, I started kind of altering the systems. So it went from like a, a spade to like a heart, and I would basically alter these different systems of how the cards would appear. And you can get a little bit of a sense of that here, where I'm like if you look in the center of the screen, there's one three of clubs, but I basically cut out a two of spades or a three of spades. And so when I replaced that top face card, it changed the entire kind of symbolism associated with the game. And it's basically just breaking these rules and structures that allow the game to play and function in the first place, which I just found really interesting as it relates to not just the prison system, but all of the rules and kind of elements in society that feed into the prison system.
Mm.
And so this is the work installed at the Met currently. Um, and I thought it was really interesting. So I included one of these slides because when I was working with the curator there, she had mentioned that they had this amazing archive of Bertillon photographs, who was basically this kind of French photographer who pretty much birthed the origins of our contemporary mugshot. And so we kind of paired these works on one wall opposing Purgatory. And I thought it was a really interesting foil when you start to think about kind of the birth of the mugshot originating from this idea of how to weaponize photography against people. And so everyone depicted in these photographs were considered anarchists at the time. And they'll like have these little kind of definitions on the back of their age and weights and kind of identifying markers. But the crimes that they're actually charged with are like theft, pickpocketing, or loitering, nothing to do with their like anarchist nature, but more to like how laws are kind of leveraged against a group of people that the government deems to be a threat. And so I thought that was fascinating. And then also the added element of like when you look at these, everyone in these pictures are clearly white. And so when you start to look at the mugshots transferred on Purgatory, you'll see how this history has kind of continued, but has been kind of weaponized and targeted against Black and brown people predominantly. And so this is just an image of the overall installation of that work. I think the other thing that this work does really effectively, because again, I made this over a period of a year, so it really kind of begins to capture that essence of time and kind of marking that amount of time through the repetition of these works and how they're installed. Again, like highlighting the humanity and the individuals impacted by the system, but also the broader system itself. And this is a pretty good image because I feel like it gives you a sense of the works installed in totality, but also like some of the other kind of fragments and elements that went into creating this work. So you can kind of see in the bottom of your screen the envelopes that I used to send these cards out in, two at a time. There's also all of the original kind of mugshots or portraits that were in the newspaper, and then soaps with the transfers and the cards. So you get an idea of all of the kind of elements that went into this year-long project.
And so within the system, they allow you to send out lots and lots of letters. That's one of your privileges.
Yes. However, technically, when you're in solitary confinement specifically, you're not allowed to seal the envelopes. And so you can send out letters, but you have to leave them unsealed. And then the guard comes by, collects a letter, inspects it for contraband or anything, and then we'll seal it and put it in the mailbox for you. Because my works were actually contraband, I could not just go through that process in a normal manner. And so the thing that I ended up doing is that I formed a friendship with he was considered or called a trustee on the block. And basically a trustee is just another person who's incarcerated and does a lot of the works that the guards are supposed to do, but don't really want to do, mostly because they're kind of lazy. And so this trustee would be allowed out of his cell, and as a part of that, he was in charge of kind of cleaning the hallway outside of all of our cells and wiping down the phones and doing the kind of cleanup. But in order for him to do that, he had to get access to go out into the external hallway, which only the guards had access to. and get cleaning supplies to bring back into the block. And in his kind of route of going out to the cleaning supplies is the mail drop box. It's just a slit in a wall where the guards, after they would seal, would drop the mail once they leave the unit. But he could, if I gave him these covertly, he could just slip them in the box real quick while he was grabbing the cleaning supplies and coming back into the block, or vice versa. And I worked out an exchange with him. And again, this is kind of like the power of artwork, not just to form resistance, but also to like really build community. And so I started kind of drawing, or I started drawing portraits of his daughters and his kids for their birthdays and for holidays as a way to pay him. But also, if you think about it, when you're in prison, as an artist, you are one of the only people who can actually create something physical and tangible that people can send to their loved ones to show that they still love them and that they still care. And so you very quickly become a highly respected member of that community. But yeah, so it was a way of forming community, forming artworks that are kind of critical about the system, and then figuring out strategic ways to actually get them out of the system without being confiscated.
Thanks.
Mm-hmm. And so then I eventually got transferred to a federal prison. And after being in solitary for a year, I took a plea agreement. There's a whole crazy story that goes along with that, but I'm going to spare all of you just for the sake of time and focus on the work. But basically, after I had pled guilty and got sentenced and got sent to a actual federal facility, I had much more access to, well, maybe not much more. I just had some access to more materials. And so I was now in general population. I could move from my compound to a recreation center, to the yard, to other areas within this prison. And as a part of that, I think my works really started to kind of take a different shape because I started to kind of use a similar process that I developed when I was in solitary, but instead of transferring images onto soap, I was now using hair gel and a spoon to transfer images from the newspaper onto the surface of prison bed sheets. And so kind of in the same way that soap was, I think, the latent language of the soap was kind of connecting to the idea of the penitentiary, I think the bed sheets for me also began to kind of serve as this vehicle that could really convey some of these ideas that are often very intentionally hidden. And so the prison bed sheets themselves are produced using prison labor in a program called Unicor. And Unicor are these basically like these prison facilities that hire people to work in them from the prison. They pay you, I don't know, maybe like $1 to $1.20 an hour. And they're like the best paying jobs you can possibly get in a federal prison. But they produce everything from these bed sheets to like Kevlar for the military, to solar panels, to all sorts of other products that aren't necessarily out in competition in the private market, but they're through government contracts. So these are like huge, huge, massive factories producing all sorts of products. And so the bed sheets was one of them. And I started to think about the idea of the bed sheet and like what it's used for, to literally kind of cover and hide our bodies as we sleep in the prison system. And I began kind of transferring images on those as my canvas, thinking that when they're actually displayed out in the world, that I can use this to talk about the material in one sense as a way to kind of highlight this hidden prison production system. I mean, what we're talking about in like no uncertain terms here is slavery, right? Like it's basically like instead of people being forced to go out into the fields and pick cotton, what is happening is now we incarcerate people, put them behind these massive walls, and then open up these huge factories in these prisons that are producing things for the government. And based at like slave wages. And so using the prison bed sheets was kind of a way for me to highlight some of these issues. And this is the very first panel I made when I was in the federal system. And eventually, over a period of 3 years, this turned into a work that is 15 feet tall and 40 feet long and comprised of over 39 prison bed sheets. And so these are all image transfers out of the newspaper onto the surface of the bed sheet. And then I would come back over with colored pencil and color in and kind of connect everything into this very surrealist landscape. And for me, I think it was really interesting conceptually when I started to think about all these images in the newspaper. Because again, if you just read like the New York Times, actually, maybe I should say this first. I think we're all kind of trained through our traditional education system to be able to read and kind of contextualize what we've just read and really get some kind of criticality or understanding about the text that we've just encountered and read, but we're not taught how to read visual language. And so, in my mind, visual language has the same exact kind of impact as a text has. But most people in our society are not trained to read visual language as a matter of going through a traditional school system. And when I began to look at the New York Times and all of these images of things that are happening in the world, all of the kind of like death and destruction and natural disasters, man-made disasters, and then also looking at like what actually takes up visibly the most space in a newspaper. And that is oftentimes full page advertisements for like J. Crew or Ralph Lauren or whatever kind of commercial advertisement is in the paper. And so you kind of you begin to see this like very um, drastic treatment of prominence for things that are of value or of worth in a commercial sense, and then how all of the other images of the things happening in the world are so small, so much drastically smaller than that. And then even in terms of like how they're laid out, I remember reading one paper where on the front page or at some point in the section of the newspaper, it was talking about the earthquake in Haiti. And as I flipped through the paper and got to the travel section, there was a depiction of Haiti as this like tourist destination. And I'm just thinking like narratively of like the disconnect that is happening within not just within the visual language, but within like what you're portraying to viewers of like who's going to come to Haiti at this time and have a certain type of experience over what's actually happening in Haiti. Um, and so anyway, I thought it was really interesting. And so when you think about this project in relation to purgatory, purgatory is a lot about the people who are incarcerated and the systems connected to that. But I think Apocalyptine is much broader, and it's talking about the value systems as they exist throughout society and how things are portrayed and how that actually starts to form our norms and understandings of who's valuable and who's disposable. Because even when you look at the models in this, they're all skinny white women, right? It's like it's one body type that are they're all women. They're basically used in a variety of ways to sell products. Um, but again, like when this starts getting reiterated time and time again through every mediated outlet, it starts to portray that what we view as at least Western society as valuable and beautiful is skinny white women, right? And there's no other real room or depictions of different body types, different races, or anything else. And so I think that's just like one example of like what happens when people aren't necessarily trained to read visual language, but how it has real impact on how we form our value systems.
So, Jesse, just looking at this image, this is 3 bed sheets high.
Yes. So basically what I would do is I would take, well, I'm using the bed sheet in a different configuration. So I would take one full bed sheet and then I would turn it sideways and rip it in half. And so I would get 2 panels out of one bed sheet. And so this is the width version becomes the height here.
Mm.
Bed sheets were hard to come by in prison. I had to orchestrate an entire system and work a deal out with the guy who worked in laundry and pay him stamps so that he would smuggle out new sheets for me so I could use for my project. Everything's a
You get
bit,
the horizon to match because you were doing each of these and then posting them out. So you didn't necessarily know. I mean, you didn't see the whole thing together until you came home.
right. Yeah, and again, because this is definitely considered contraband, I'm basically destroying prison property in the sheets and I'm defacing them by transferring images on them. And so as soon as I would finish one panel, I would mail it out. And the way that I was thinking about how to kind of actually create some kind of consistency amongst the horizon line was I basically used the desk that I was working on as the parameters for how I thought about how to organize the composition. And so to say that more plainly, it's that for the Earth section, I knew that if I just put the images out on the desk in the
It's just
configure
the Earth section.
the center section.
Okay.
So there's it's heaven, earth, and hell. But again, that's also kind of up to the viewer because all of these images are inverted. So you could also view heaven as hell or hell as heaven. But they all kind of revolve around this singular axis of the earth scenes. Um, but basically the center panel that has all of the large female figures on it, um, that the bottom third of that panel was basically the size of my desk. And that's how I knew to keep those images that size. The figures obviously could kind of scale up into it, but the base of that center panel was the actual depth of my desk and width. And so I knew if I did that as image transfer, that everything above it then would be sky. And I knew that everything below it on the bottom panels would just be full image transfer to create um, this vertical triptych structure.
Mm.
And then this is a piece that I created after I had come home. So this is basically a recreation of Apocalyptine at Eastern State Penitentiary, which is the first penitentiary in the world. This is pretty much the origin of solitary confinement in the world, um, as it relates to like a carceral system. And they have this amazing art program there. And so I got selected to kind of build out an art installation, which is still up. Typically they're only up for a year, but I think mine's been up for about 8 years now. Um, but again, I thought this was a really interesting way to show Apocalyptine within this system, because for me, it kind of radically changes the experience of it. It becomes fully immersive in this very confined space. And different people read this very differently, where it becomes very overwhelming. Like when you walk into this space, it feels like there's just this constant barrage of imagery coming at you. And some people find it very kind of ethereal and uplifting. So I found that kind of interesting. But the reason I included this is because I always think, at least both in the creation of my works and how they're displayed, I think about how viewers engage with them. And this seemed like an amazing opportunity to install this in a historical site where the visitors who are coming aren't even thinking about artwork. Like they're coming for the spectacle of the prison itself. And then they just happen across upon these artworks that are kind of interspersed throughout the prison. And so it became a really interesting way to kind of engage people in these conversations that I don't necessarily think would come to like a art museum or an exhibition.
But it's interesting because the image before, that kind of curved version, that was at PS1 as part of marking time
Yeah.
in the age of mass incarceration. And then for those of you that are interested, if you Google Jess's name and New York Times. There was a New York Times article that came out last week
Yeah.
about both the Met and the Jack Shaman show, and there they have like video footage as one image. This is the great thing about the newspaper. So you can see a kind of close up of the way in which Apocalyptine is presented in the Met. Jesse, there's one question that says, I'm curious about how when Jesse got connected to the Met to the extent as to have a show there.
Can you reframe that? What is the question?
How did the Met invite you to do a show? How did that come about?
Got you. Um, so basically I was at an event in Miami during Art Basel actually 2 years ago at this point. Um, and I went to one of the Met's events and got connected to this curator, Lisa Sutcliffe. And she had told me that she's been meaning to reach out. She'd love to set up a studio visit. And that she was like thinking about this new acquisition that the Met just had of these Bertillon photographs and wanted to kind of talk to me about Purgatory. And so we set up a studio visit. She came down. We had a conversation. I showed her a bunch of my work. And then I think about a month after that, she came down again with the head of the photography department. We had another kind of broader, in-depth conversation. And from there, she said that she wanted to work with me on an exhibition. We were kind of thinking through what that might look like, but she was very intentional about like showcasing these works, but also kind of putting them in conversation with other works from the Met's archive. And she said, it didn't have to be Bertillon's photographs in particular, but like I could have pulled anything from the Met and kind of basically curated this show and put them in conversations together. But that was kind of the genesis. And then we worked together back and forth, kind of refining what we were thinking about, what I was interested in, probably over like the following year, until up to the lead up of the exhibition.
Mhm.
I think the other thing that's important, and I don't have images of it because it's so hard to capture good images, but the other thing that I was really kind of interested as a part of this exhibition opportunity at the Met was I really wanted to create a new work so that I wasn't just showing Purgatory and Apocalyptine in conversation with the Met Archive. I wanted the opportunity to create something new, which felt very important to me. Because again, at this point, these works are over 10 years old, more in some cases. And I really wanted to find a way to kind of almost create like a full circle moment of where I'm at in my practice now and how I'm thinking in relation to the works that I made while I was inside as well.
And again, it's very useful having the video in the New York Times article because there's a close up of that work that is, I mean, you have to go and see it. It's otherwise pretty much impossible to
Yeah.
comprehend based on
Yeah.
the scale and the kind of small pieces that are in the work, isn't it?
Yeah. And I guess I can say that that piece is made up of over 10,000 pebbles, from mostly from prison yards across the country that people on the inside have been sending to me. I've sent them a prompt to find the ideal pebble. Um, and that comes from a quote from Carl Jung that talks about if you go out into the riverbed and you collect all of the pebbles and you weigh them and you find that average weight, that you could spend the rest of your life going out into that riverbed and never find a pebble that actually weighs that average weight. And to me, that was a beautiful kind of encapsulation of how individuals are very unique, and that when you try to basically create these normalized standards and systems that they don't actually apply to the kind of contextual uniqueness of every individual in a way that's effective. Um, but anyway, so those pebbles are all wrapped in thread, suspended from the wall with needles. And then there are image transfers of this work of Apocalyptine over individual threads which suspend the stones. And so that's kind of the basis, but it's much better to see it in person, to get a sense of the materials and the process and the scale of it. It's also 15 feet by 40 feet long.
So we've got 20 minutes left, Jesse.
Okay, I'm talking a lot. Um, and so this is another body of work. I included this because, again, this is like a very different material. So this is blown glass in cage forms. And these are roots that I've basically pulled up out of the ground or that were kind of unearthed during storms. And I was going through Google algorithms to find various images. Because my thinking with that was that, I was exploring the kind of mediated landscape within a print newspaper, but understanding that in a much more contemporary context, that most people get their information online. And so I started thinking about these algorithms as hidden systems that kind of dictate what we see, what's viewed as valuable and what's viewed as disposable. And this is an exhibition I created, kind of around those ideas of algorithms and how to effectively capture that sense. Um, and so the the bases of these have all of the actual images that resulted from X search criteria. So I might put in an image of beauty, and then I would adjust for every single category that you could adjust for, like beauty white, beauty red, beauty blue. I'd do it by color. I'd do it by word association. And so that's kind of like the archive of the image search. And then the little fruit pieces that you see are cut up transparency films with digital inkjet prints on them. And I kind of melted them together into these fruit-like structures that basically combined ideas of beauty and disposability together into one fruit. And again, it was really interesting because no matter what I did, if I did beauty black or beauty any related word, the search always kind of pulled back to whiteness. Always pulled back to whiteness no matter what. Like if I did beauty beach black, I'd think like, maybe something different, diverse will come up, but it would just be a white woman on the beach with a black flower in her ear. And so like this pull back to whiteness as a standard of beauty was really interesting through these algorithms. And then this is getting towards like my more recent body of work. I included this because I've also been working with people who are incarcerated to create elegy quilts. And so I've basically been asking them to describe um, either verbally to me over the phone or written descriptions of their favorite memories of spaces from when they were home. And I basically take their descriptions and I recreate them using old clothing that their families have given to me and other assorted textiles. But there's always an element of their actual clothing incorporated in these quilts, to kind of recreate their favorite domestic interior scene from the last time they were home. And then I was also asking them, if they could be any animal, which one would they be and why? And so I would take that animal and kind of incorporate it into these scenes as symbolic stand-ins for the individual as well. And I think, and I think this is like a nice lead in into my newer body of work.
Oh, Jesse, before that, I've got a couple of questions. So there's one that I wanted to ask you before you go into the new body.
Hmm.
This is from Nicholas Toulouse. In the book The Meaning of Life by V. Frankl, the author speaks of a certain optimism, one that he felt was an unhealthy substitution for something like faith, in that some of those people never saw the light of day again. While many museums have been built on the subject, did you encounter a certain optimism in your prison mates about the notion of escape or something like it through your experience?
Um, Not necessarily. I think I think everyone's kind of experience in there vary drastically.
Mhm.
Um, I think different people handled that situation in very different ways. And so some people, I think, ascribe to maybe um, being overly optimistic and uh, as a way of holding on to hope. I think that that was definitely common because again, like there are people in there who are serving decades of their life, and so they're fighting their case, they're trying to come home. They're often creating, they're writers, they're poets, they're artists. Um, and I think there is a bit of an innate optimism that some people can kind of subscribe to as a way to get through that system. But I've also seen the inverse of that, where I think I've seen people's hope or optimism get ground down to the point where they actually succumb to this or conform to this idea of criminality. And they actually go the entire other direction where they feel like they have no hope, they have no outlet, and that then kind of takes on a completely different shape. Um, and again, I think that's really what the prison system itself is designed to do, is to get you to conform and buy into this idea that you are a criminal. Because the prison system itself basically survives also off of people coming back into it.
Mhm.
Um, so yeah, I just think in general it's a very varied um, kind of experience for everyone.
Mhm. You have 10 minutes.
Okay.
And I have
Uh,
three more questions in, no, two more questions in the hopper at the moment.
okay. But this should be fairly quick because this is all from the new body of work. I've included a bunch of images, but basically for this, um, I was thinking about the animals that people were selecting to represent them in the elegy quilts. And in the process of finding the animals that I would eventually use in those quilts, I kept coming across these art historical depictions of animals being hunted or caged or killed or controlled in some kind of way. And it really stuck with me. And so for this new body of work, I wanted to kind of touch on the punitive ideology, which is like so embedded, particularly within Western culture and depicted within art historical paintings. And so I went back through and I took this image of a stag that has a crown around its neck and a chain that goes down that's staked in the ground, and transferred it onto fabric. And then I basically innovated this embroidery technique that allows me to kind of embroider in space. And I covered that image with this embroidery. And so for me, this is the embroidery becomes symbolic of incarceration. Um, and I guess I should say this as a kind of grounding in that the embroidery designs come from microscopic images of um, different forms of cancer cells. And so some are breast cancer, some are bone marrow cancer, and other various forms of cancer from a microscopic image that I use as the design. And then I went through, photoshopped out all of the cancerous cells, leaving only the healthy tissue behind. And that became the kind of base for these final embroidery pieces that I'm making and using to cover these art historical images of the caging and killing of animals. And so for me, the embroidery starts to represent incarceration. It's obstructing your view. It's hiding these animals, um, and it kind of captures this broader system, I think, in an effective way. This is a detail image of the embroidery process.
How many layers is that?
So basically, there's a layer of fabrics that are pieced together as like a canvas. And then there's an image transfer on that layer. And then I come back and work over it by hand with paint or colored pencil or whatever works the best. And then I put two layers of embroidery over this one.
Mm. So the kind of the finer one at the back, that's one layer, and then there's a thicker layer
Yeah. Yeah,
going.
these are two different types of cancer cells. And so again, this is like from a very famous painting, um, or tapestry, where it has a monkey sitting there with a chain around his neck to this weight that's sitting behind him. And I think, yeah, so this is one of the largest pieces in the show. This is same process. This is a much larger work, but this is from The Hunt of the Unicorn. And I basically kind of recontextualize all seven of those scenes into a triptych. Um, and I, I'm kind of out of time, so I don't want to like go super in detail with some of this stuff, but for me, basically, this is a way of kind of capturing, again, this like almost innate urge, particularly within like white culture to like oppress and control, um, everything. And like the idea of the hunt of the unicorn is like this mythical, magical creature who comes to this river, dips its horn in the water, purifies it so all of the men can drink and the animals can drink and everyone can be great and thriving. And then the men are like, great, we should go kill it. Right? Like that's the whole story basically behind this depiction. And so I kind of recontextualized that story into a very different narrative and then covered it with the embroidery.
What was the narrative you redepicted it as?
Uh, so basically, I kind of used all of the visual elements that the were in all seven of these scenes, and I recontextualized it in a way to actually highlight what the essence of that story is. And so the end scene is when the unicorn has already been killed and it's in this like garden surrounded by this fence and it's chained and it has a collar around its neck and it's supposed to be like the resurrection of Christ, right? That's like what historians talk about. But in my end scene, I put an earlier hunt of the men when they were trying to kill the unicorn, surrounding it and stabbing it even in this resurrection. And it's
Mm.
basically talking about how this like idea of oppression and control and incarceration and whatever punitive form that is taken is actually a disease within people, right?
Mm.
Like it's an ideology that people subscribe to, which has real impacts in the world, but it's not something that's like not uncurable, right? Like this is something that can change, but it comes from this place of needing to control, needing to have power, and needing to oppress other people in order to have that power. And there are a million other systems and ways of being and existing in the world without having to do that. And we know that historically through other cultures and through other practices. And so I was basically trying to capture the essence of what the Hunt of the Unicorn was actually displaying, rather than like the religious story that they kind of couch everything in.
Mm. There's a question here, but I think you pretty much answered it, and I know you have a couple more slides. Um, but it says, how do you imagine your work impacts someone who has never had contact with the prison system? How do you address the possibility of specific audiences feeling distance from these themes? But I think this new body of work kind of goes some way towards.
Yeah, I think, I mean, there's always this question of like the aesthetics versus the politics, right? And for me, I very intentionally use aesthetic tropes of beauty, and I make works that are from a distance or even up close, I think very beautiful, and very inviting. And so, because I'm dealing conceptually with things that are much darker, much heavier, I very intentionally try to make things incredibly beautiful to invite the viewer into the space in a way that I feel like anyone can kind of enter into this. You can enter into this conversation purely from an aesthetic standpoint, or you can start to kind of delve into the actual concepts that it's exploring. But ultimately, I think my hope is that it sparks a conversation, that it sparks an idea in people and in ways of seeing. And so, I would also say, I think the idea that people aren't impacted by incarceration is a fallacy. Actually, 1 in 3 people in this country have an immediate family member who's incarcerated. It's an incredibly high amount of people. And even if you don't know someone who's been directly incarcerated themselves, you're swimming in the waters of all of the things that feed into the carceral system. And so there's no escaping it. Like even if you think about surveillance and new technology and all of the things that are happening in the world, like there are aspects of incarceration or control that basically impact all of us every single day, whether you're aware of it or not. Um, but yeah, I think there's I'd like to try to create a lot of different entry points for people to come into these works.
Mhm. So a couple of minutes on your last slides.
Yeah. And so I think the other part of my practice, which is very important, is being in community with other people who are directly impacted. And kind of to that point, so what I've done in 2016 with Russell Craig, who is one of the co-founders of Right of Return, is we created an organization that basically funds and supports directly impacted artists across the country. It's a national organization. We've funded artists, 6 artists every year, give them $20,000 grants, connect them to a network of support and community. And we've done that for the past 6 years. We currently have 36 fellows. We're about to announce 6 new ones. But again, it's like it's really important for me as a directly impacted artist to, particularly as like a white man and directly impacted, I'm getting all of these opportunities, I'm getting invited to show and have all these experiences. And the thing that I know for certain is that I am not absolutely reflective of what the carceral system is. And so how do we actually create a system or a structure that helps support other artists who should be out front and center talking about these issues, making work in really interesting ways? And so that was the genesis of Right of Return. And that has since grown into the Center for Art and Advocacy. And so through that process of doing an open application every year and selecting 6 fellows, we very quickly realized that there were gaps that we were not filling. And so to help fill those gaps, we created the center. And the center is basically a 3-prong approach to supporting directly impacted artists at every stage of their career. And so for the artists who were applying to the fellowship, but clearly had lost decades of artistic community and decades of their life behind bars, it was very clear that we needed a program, which we call the Academy, which is going to be designed primarily for emerging artists, connect them with mentors and programming and practice sustainability and how to like write grants and build a website, as a way to kind of help people develop an artistic practice in a professional way. And then again, for people who have lost literal decades of their life behind bars, we're building a residency program. And so artists who may have been working in one medium, but have never had the chance to explore how to make something in bronze or do photography, they'll have that opportunity at this residency. And I think ultimately, the way that I think about both my practice and this nonprofit, the center, is that I'm pretty much using or trying to use every single option and opportunity that I have to give back and to provide support for other artists. And really, I think fundamentally change the ways that we think about how we support people who are often the most disadvantaged people who have been incarcerated. And I do that through my visual practice. I do that through my artwork, through trying to change the conversation, create different perspectives, but also through very direct community building and like a support system for other artists who are also engaged in these issues, who are amazing artists, but are not getting amplified or the support that they actually need to thrive as a practicing artist. And so that's pretty much how my individual practice and this nonprofit function.
Well, thank you, Jesse. It was incredible to learn the kind of different facets, and thank you to everybody who joined us today. And yeah, with the curatorial cohort, see you in the other Zoom.
Thank you for having me.
You're welcome. Bye.